Yeah. Right. Let's talk to you about management and business. This is the first of three sessions in the theme of orientating you around what a business is and how a business works. And I'm going to guide you through these three lessons. You don't have to watch all of them. You don't have to watch them in order. And they're there to give you a frame of reference for you to understand what business and what management is about. I'm going to retreat into the corner of your screen and guide you through a structured presentation. Let me do that. There's a problem I've had in the many years in which I've taught management principles and management theory, and that is that, especially for a very young audience, there's no point in talking to you about business management unless we've spoken to you about business. And that's what this is about, because I fail to see how it is that you can learn the necessary or relevant theory without knowing how businesses developed in the first place. So that's the hint over here, is that I'm going to be taking us on a bit of a history lesson. And that history lesson is something intended to guide you in the origin of our species and the origin of our human behavior with respect to the trade which we conduct as business activity. There's a history to business, and that is the history of the evolution of our species. There is an anthropologist I admire, and Ian Morris, in his book Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels, talks to us like this. He maintains we have this advantage over all the other species on the planet, and he talks about our sophistication, and he talks about our capacity for invention and reinvention. That is something which sets us apart. And I'm going to say that the businesses we run are exercises in invention and continuous reinvention as our environments change. He points out that we've evolved as humans, as Homo sapiens, from being very agricultural, if you like, or agrarian, to being very industrialized. Now, across the face of the planet, you'll find that some societies are more industrialized than others. The point remains, however, that there is this movement, this shift which has occurred in the last 10, 12,000 years. And this is what he draws our attention to. He explains that our foraging is something which says that our energy capture becomes very, very limited. And we make no attempt to manage the environment in which we exist. We simply live in conjunction with it. It's great to be living naturally, but he does explain the limitation of this, and the limitations would be our limited capacity to consume and absorb energy and exploit that energy to, like using fuel, for example, to drive to work, to exploit that energy to get work done. Now, it is the case, and critically, it is the case that we've been foragers for most of our human history. He points out about 90% thereof, and it doesn't mean that we no longer forage. It's just taken on a new tone. There's little difference, and we are condemned, many of us, to foraging for a living. It isn't a popular strand of discussion or narrative, but this is how we survive. It becomes possible to turn this into something which is a means of earning a living, though, beyond simply surviving. And I will give you a demonstration over here of Invest in Dignity, an eThekwini-based business in Pinetown, run by the wonderful personality you see in the middle of that photograph, who has created opportunity for 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 women, unemployed women, to scratch out recyclable litter on the streets of Pinetown and then sell it back to recyclers. Great business, great idea, and we might in fact come back to that one in this lecture series. The evolution from foraging to farming is something which Morris explains as um, um, let me rather just quote him. Foragers are people who exercise no deliberate alteration of the gene pool of exploited resources. What does that mean? They live in small groups and they move around a heck of a lot because they have to go where the food is. The alternative is to domesticate plant species and to improve their productive yield, and then to stay in the same place and grow those plants and animals. And that means you move around very, very little. And it's the key distinction, if you like, between foraging and farming, that there's just this no movement. You remain where you are. There is, of course, in the case of big farms, where people are living on large farms, there isn't room for other people to live, and that is a source of human conflict. So we must be careful of saying that we can all become farmers and that we'll all be happy because we're all okay. It is the case that large-scale commercial farming doesn't accommodate very many people, and for that matter, doesn't really employ very many people either. But it is a very significant way of producing our foodstuffs as a population. So, and I find this to be a key statement. In foragers, mobile but tiny bands, the places change because they're moving, but the faces stay the same. In farmers, static but big villages, the faces change, but the places stay the same. Now, what is a big farm, and what does it take for a farm to be profitable? Because what you see there is very clearly evidence of a very big farm. I'm reproducing for you here, a segment or a section of an article produced by Rudd back in 1941. He writes, and I'll read to you, this leads to a discussion of the unit of organization on the farm. On the great wheat fields in California, the unit may be based upon the combined harvester and thresher. Those were photographs on the preceding slide in this presentation. This machine and the crew to operate it, and the land, and the men and the other equipment required to raise that amount of wheat, which can be cut during the normal harvest period, may here make up the unit of organization. Beyond a certain point in increasing size, it becomes necessary to duplicate important pieces of machinery and certain buildings. In the world of business and management, we now refer to that as scaling up the enterprise. But Rudd's point was that a certain number of acres or hectares of land could be farmed productively and effectively with a certain complement of people and machinery. So this poses a bit of a question, you see. What you see there is some machinery, and it's wonderful machinery. It is also very expensive machinery. And at 2 million Rand for a 2009 used item, you recognize that we're not going to be buying very many of those. It's also the case that if we can only afford to buy one of those machines because they're so expensive, there's a limit to how much land we can farm. So if, particularly in a country like South Africa, we don't have the money to afford land and resources and machines like this wonderful John Deere, then you recognize we are limited in scale, the unit of organization, to something far more humble. And while what you see there as a cabbage field could be anything, I would guess, at about 1 acre to 2 acres of property, and possibly well beyond that, there's a limit to what you can do with this labor intensive form of agriculture, and those heads of cabbage look absolutely wonderful. There are alternatives. You can make the agricultural process a far more intensive one. And what you would see here is an equivalent size of land, but under cover and using drip feed irrigation, which is geared towards the growth phase in the life cycle of the plant, and then in the maturity or fruiting life phase of the life cycle of the plant. Effectively, we can grow plants in enclosed or controlled environments most successfully where we have the greatest control over the environmental conditions. My point, a farming business is just a collection of resources. If you are lacking resources, then the business is going to struggle. And that is one of the key fundamental dynamics of any business enterprise. Profitable farming ends up being much larger in size or scale because we achieve increasing returns to scale. In South Africa, in what is a developing country, there's not an enormous amount of capital available to invest in endless amounts of machinery. It's also the case that there are other factors of production, and we'll return to that in this module. There are other factors of production, and all of those have to be optimized. Now, we engaged in agriculture for, as Morris points out, at least 90% of our existence as a species on the planet. But while we continue to engage in agriculture, because there's 8 billion people to feed, it is the case that we discovered fossil fuels in great volume, which changed the game. And we need to expand upon that. It is the case that we've always relied on solar energy to keep going. In other words, you take the sun away and we don't thrive and plants don't grow. So that solar energy is vital to our well-being. But we've been able to harness more energy than just the sun. In other words, by burning coal in our coal-fired power plants, and I happen to have a lump of coal behind me, it's a feature of the work that I've been involved in. That lump of coal comes from one of South Africa's coal fields. We burn hundreds of tons of this stuff every hour of the day in order to put the lights on. And with the lights on, we are no longer constrained to getting up with the sun and going to bed with the sun set. We can operate beyond that. We, in fact, can operate 24/7, 365. We can go every day of the week for 24 hours a day. And that distinguishes then what we were able to do 200 and 300 years ago when we didn't operate 24-hour shifts. Bottom line is we can get more done. And as a student, you can get more studying done because you can study at night. So the deposits we're using, because this exposes another problem, is something which was laid down in our archaeological record, if you like, or paleontological record 300 to 360 million years ago. And we're not making more of it. When it's exhausted, it's going to be gone. So one of the aspects of business management and business generally is the sustainability of the pace and the rate at which we extract fossil fuels from the Earth's crust. The ability, however, to extract those fossil fuels from the Earth's crust was something which set our development path apart. And here's a graph to show you what I mean. What you see over there in the pale gray line is something which emphasizes the way that the West has grown over time, and most rapidly from about the 1800s or thereabouts, whereas the darker line demonstrates where the East has started to catch up. And it's tipped to be the case, Morris claims, that there is going to come a point when the East will exceed the development of the West. Now, with this in mind, we must question or query rather what the consequences of fossil fuel exploitation were. Morris tells us about 200 years ago, we started to use fossil fuels big time, and that led to scaled industrialization. We saw much of it in what we refer to as the United Kingdom in terms of that particular land mass. And what the breakthrough of capturing energy from the Earth's crust led to was what we refer to as an empire, which, as Morris writes, was able to project its power across the entire globe in the 19th century. So by 1914, most of the people on Earth were part of a Western-dominated fossil fuel economy and tied to global markets. That's a key one, because I'm going to give you a map which demonstrates what I mean by global markets. The Europeans were able to take control of 84% of the planet's land mass and 100% of its oceans, the Great British Navy of the 1800s. And we mustn't forget the navies of Portugal, for example. So there's a map of the trade routes, and what we see here is the most incredible thing. I'll sketch Great Britain for you. So we see here Scotland and England and Wales about here, and Northern Ireland, and we see France and Germany, and we see Spain, the Basque area of Spain and France, this intersection. We see Africa, and we are able to trace Egypt and the Sinai and the Red Sea over here. So we crossed the planet in ships and with camel trains and elephant trains in the case of Hannibal, with horses, with wagons. The Romans traveled on paved roads that we still use, and we are still uncovering evidence of between Europe and the Middle East. That rapid development, the upshot of that, as I call it, is this: we bartered goods. There was no money involved. We bartered goods. That's what trade is about. You recognize that if you have more goods than you require, for example, as a cabbage farmer, the problem with a cabbage farmer is that while you have lots of cabbage, you don't have very many potatoes. So it's wise to find someone with a potato field with whom you can do a barter and exchange his potatoes or her potatoes for your cabbages. That allows us to engage in all manner of other industrial activity in terms of producing goods from those raw materials, and that requires people, a lot of people, because someone has to sow those root vegetables, someone needs to harvest those, and someone needs to package them, and someone needs to transport them. They need to be sold, and they need to be served to customers. That is activity which has to be controlled. And the control of that activity, the organization of that activity, the planning of that activity is something that we call management. At this point in time, I'm going to come back to your screen and say, I think we'll leave it at that, and we'll return to this, because what we have here are some insights into where business comes from. Now we need to look at how management evolved as a science and as an art, to take control and care of those business activities.